This is a personal history recorded interview of Lee Elizabeth Ursula Baum Gilbert, a Mischling who fled Nazi persecution with her brother, Jewish father, and Protestant mother. This interview takes place in her home in Waterford, Michigan. The interview is a project of the Holocaust Memorial Center, Zeckelman Family Campus in Farmington Hills, Michigan, established by the Sharita Plata. The date is April 17, 2016. The interviewer is Ziva Canvasser. The videographer is Kevin Walsh. Please identify yourself by stating your name, any previous names you have had or used, and when and where you were born.
Okay, my name is Elizabeth Gilbert, but I was named Ursula when I was a little kid by my mother. She loved the name. Ursula Elizabeth. Every female member of my family is an Elizabeth, including my granddaughters and my great-granddaughter. And my last name was Baum, B-A-U-M, and my married name is Gilbert.
And where were you born?
I was born in Frankfurt, Germany, February 25th, 1930, which makes me 86 years young.
And would you tell us something about your family?
Well, my dad was born in a family of 6 children. His mother was widowed in her 20s and was left alone to raise the 6 children. My grandfather died of pneumonia at the age of 29 or 30 or something like that, very young. And my grandmother, whom I've never met, raised those 6 kids by taking over my grandfather's insurance business and running a little shop where she sold dry goods. And she put her kids through school. But my father was supposed to be the brightest, so she sent him to a yeshiva to become a rabbi, which was a tradition in her family. But my father, after a few years in the yeshiva, he was only 14 when he went, decided that was not what he wanted to do. He really wanted to work as a social worker. So somehow he arranged to go to the University of Cologne and get his degree in social work, and then he got his master's. He met my mother at an institute of, I don't remember the name of it, but she was also a social worker. And my mother came from a Christian family. Her father was a professional military man, an officer. She grew up in quite a lot of luxury. And she was sent to finishing school after she finished high school, or whatever they call it there. But she didn't like the finishing school. She thought that's not what she wanted to do. She wanted to go out and do things for humanity. And so she also went to the University of Cologne to become a social worker. Her grandmother sympathized with her because she herself was a liberated person and sent her to the college and paid for tuition and so on. And then they both worked at the institute.
What were their names?
My mother's name?
Mm-hmm.
Caroline Elizabeth Carolina Klebenstein.
And your father?
Walter Maximilian Baum. They fell in love, and my mother was helping my dad to do for his doctoral thesis, which he completed with her help. And they fell in love, and then they had to go break it to their parents that they wanted to get married, which was a bit of an uphill road, a very heavy uphill road. Because of that, I never met my father's family. But because 1933, when I was 3 years old, Hitler came into power. And what they told me later on when I finally met them when I was a grown woman is that they wanted to protect us, my brother and I, and not associate with us, hoping that we would escape the Holocaust.
This was the Jewish family.
Yes. The Christian family was very supportive. Well, my grandparents, not the rest of the family. In many ways, they helped us many, many ways too. When my father was, well, actually in 1933 already the Nazis came into power, and they murdered the mayor. Well, my father was at the time, had become the city director of the city of Mannheim. And the mayor, they killed the mayor, and they left a message, "The Jew bomb next." So that night, he was taken over the border to flee the fact that they were coming after him to kill him. It was early already, but they already did that. And my mother fled to her parents' house, hoping that this would all blow over and everything was going to be okay and my dad could come back and things would be all right. But shortly after that, within a year, the word came out that they were going to come and arrest her because they said that my father was working against Hitler and she was married to a Jew and therefore they were going to come and get her. So that night, it also said the children would be, of course, taken away, the Michelins, you know. So that night, they took us over the border. The family took us over the border, put us on a train, and sent us to Paris to rejoin my father. After that...
Did you know that you were a Mischling or that meant anything?
Not at the age of 3.
Time? No.
No. It was never... I was never much aware of that. I mean, I accepted people the way they were as a child. You know, that's what children do. Mm-hmm. It didn't occur to me either way. I know we kept the Christian holidays and some of the Jewish holidays as well. And it was just part of the way I grew up. My father was not religious, but he was trained to be a rabbi, and you know, it was there. It was stuck to him. There's nothing you could erase. And I adored my father. I just totally adored him. He was a wonderful father and a very caring father. My mother too, but my mother was German and she was very strict and very, that's the way it's done. My father was the one who entertained me. Took me to a museum, he played games with me, he read a book to me every night. It was a very close father. Anyway, the first year they were in Paris was very difficult for them because there was no money, and my father was supposed to come to the States and be a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, but somehow you couldn't get the quota was closed for German-born people, and so he couldn't go, and it was very despondent. But then he went to work for the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in Paris, and things got better for us. Financially, we moved to a big apartment, and we were able to go on holidays in the summer. It was wonderful. But then my father worked very, very hard to get his brothers and sisters out of Germany, and he succeeded only with one of them. The other one was, he managed to help get to Kenya. He was an accountant, but all of a sudden became an agriculturist. You know how you do what you have to do. And actually, he loved it. And he eventually ended up owning a huge ranch and became quite well-to-do. And he was saved because he was in Dachau when they got him out of there. At the time, you could still get out in 1935 or so if you had a place to go.
What was his name?
It was Hans Baum. And he eventually sold his ranch in Nairobi because the Mau Mau took over and, you know, you had to get out of all the people who they didn't want. But he came out okay financially and moved to London, where I finally met him when I was a grown woman. And I liked him. And my Uncle Eric managed to flee to the States with his wife and daughter, and we are still very close, my cousin and I, although she lives in Florida, but she comes to visit me here. I went to visit her there, and we talk about once a week. So those are the only ones who survived the Holocaust. The oldest sibling in my father's family was killed in World War I as a soldier of Germany. And then Germany turned around and imprisoned his brother, Joseph, his wife, and his children. They were all killed at Buchenwald. They were gassed. His sister, Lily, was also sent to a camp. I don't know which one of the concentration camps. And she was killed there. His mother, as far as I know, was killed also. How she was killed, I don't know. I heard that she was thrown down the staircase of her house and was killed that way when they came to get her daughter. So from the family of 6 children, the only ones who have children of their own is my brother and I. My cousin never had children, and of course none of the others survived. So in a way, I'm proud of the fact that we have all those American descendants now. It's a large family, which we didn't have. Since we came to the States, the 4 of us, my father, my mother, my brother and I, and that was it. No cousins, except the one cousin. And it's a wonderful feeling to have a large family. But anyway, regressing back to 1934, we were actually 1939 when we were on vacation, my mother, my brother and I, in the south of France. My father had gone to England to the International Conference of Social Work. He was part of the board of that particular conference. And then the war was declared. So he returned to Paris and was immediately put into a camp because he was a foreign national, which is kind of stupid considering that he was a refugee from Germany, but because he was German, he was put into a camp. And that was the irony of the whole situation. Now, he was given the alternative of joining the French Foreign Legion or being sent somewhere else. He chose that, he took that choice. So he was sent to Sidi Bel Abbès in Africa, where he joined the French Foreign Legion. Meantime, my mother, my brother, and I were not allowed to return to Paris. We were on vacation in somewhere, and it got to be colder and colder, and we couldn't get back to Paris, foreign nationals. But eventually, because my father was in the Legion, we were allowed to return to Paris, which we did. I mean, after all, that's where our clothes and stuff and furniture and everything was in our apartment in Paris. But then the Germans started coming closer. And that was when the intention was to flee Paris with a bunch of the neighbors who also, it was a very Jewish neighborhood to begin with, and in Paris, the 15th arrondissement. And my mother packed 2 suitcases and tied them on the back of our bicycles so we would flee Paris as the Germans were advancing. So I asked permission to go in the courtyard of the building where we lived to say goodbye to my little friend who was 1 story up. So I went to the courtyard and I was waving goodbye at her and talking to her, and I backed up, not realizing that I'm trying to think of the word, the hole to ventilate the basement is a word for that. I forgot it. Senior, you know. And I fell backwards 6 feet down on my back, knocked myself out. My little friend saw me falling and she called for father, and who got a couple of men, and they climbed down and got me out and carried me home up to our apartment. My mother asked a neighbor to watch me, and she went running to see if she could find a doctor. But they were all fleeing. They were all in cars and whatever vehicles they could get. They were fleeing Paris. They were just a mass fleeing of people, lines and lines on the streets, getting out of Paris. Of course, there's no way we could go anymore at that point because I was almost paralyzed from that fall. And she could not find a doctor. So she treated me with camphor oil. I'll never forget the smell of that camphor oil. But the neighbors went, and they were walking away from Paris, and the Germans came with their planes and strafed them and machine gunned them. And so the few that survived came back, and in a way, by falling into that pit, saved our lives at that point, because we would have been in that crowd that got machine gunned. What was horrible, though, to me as a child, coming home from school, they were carrying bodies out of the houses of Jewish, mostly all women, as far as I remember, who had committed suicide. They were so terrified of going to the prison, to the concentration camps that they had heard about, that they decided to gas themselves in the ovens. And I remember distinctly this one lady they were bringing out of the building as I was walking home from school. And she was probably dead. And she had a Band-Aid on her toe. And I thought, I was 9 years old. I thought, why did she put a Band-Aid on her toe if she was going to kill herself? I remember that thought as clearly as can be. And I could smell the gas coming out of the buildings. And I was terrified that my mother would do the same. I heard her say something about that. And I was just horrified going up the staircase. The elevator was shut down because of saving electricity. So I would go up the staircase and I would smell to see if I could smell gas. Because that's, you know, I was never able to light a gas stove for years and years and years. I never wanted a gas stove because the memories of that smell of gas was horrifying. And then one morning we got up and we looked out the window. We could see the Eiffel Tower. There was the swastika on top of it. The Germans had come into Paris. Well, before that, there was a lot of bombing, and the outside factories were set on fire to keep the Germans from getting whatever it was in the factories. The merchants were giving away food to the kids on the streets, and it was just pandemonium. But then those Germans, I could hear them singing that horrible horse whistle song. They were marching in the streets and so on, and it was horrifying. And my mother said, I just didn't know exactly what to do at that point. The concierge was ordered to put the names of the residents of the building on the outside so the Germans could see who had Jewish names. So the concierge eliminated our floor completely. She changed the numbers of the flooring. She was Alsatian and she was very sympathetic. And they were friends, my parents and them. So that way, we got away for a while. Of course, my father was still in Africa.
She wasn't Jewish?
No.
Do you remember her
It didn't
name?
make any difference. Pardon?
You don't remember her name, do you?
My mother's name?
No, the
concierge? No.
Okay.
Years and years later, I went back and she had just died. I went to see her and she had just died. Her daughter was the one who called about my falling into that pit. She was very helpful. And when the Germans came for us, well, this is another story. I was coming home from school, and I saw that bus pull up. And our front door of the building had curtains. So I opened the door and I hid behind the curtain. I knew they were Germans. And I could see this one particular lady. She was sitting there on that bus weeping. And I hid behind that. And they came in the building, the Nazis, and they asked the concierge for us. And the concierge said, oh no, they fled a long time ago. My mother and brother were not home. I was the only one behind that door. And so they left. We were saved one more time. But my mother knew the time was up for us to leave as soon as possible. But she didn't quite know how to go about it. And she was walking in the street, shopping or whatever she was doing. And I have to say that shopping was difficult. Most of the stuff we could eat was rutabagas because there was nothing much else left. I remember the last glass of milk she ever gave me. She said, that is the last glass of milk. There's no more milk available. Oh, anyway, my mother was out shopping. And she had told my father years before that she was dreaming of a White House in the tropics. But anyway, when she was walking down the street, this man bumped into her and gave her a piece of paper quickly, you know, on sleight of hand. And when she opened up the paper, it was for my dad. He said, I am sent to the Dominican Republic, and I'll have to go back and say why. Try to get to the south of France and get passage to join me. Your White House awaits you. What happened is my father left the French Foreign Legion because he's short and has glasses and so on, was released from the Legion and was sent back to France. And we had a chance to be with him a few days. And then back into the camp he had to go, into a prison camp again. And they said, well, you were a legionnaire, you're going to be released in a couple of days, but it didn't happen. They took him to the middle of France, And when the Germans approached, they got up in the morning and the guards were all gone. They had fled. So the prisoners decided they were going to flee too. And he walked all the way to Spain and went across the Pyrenees into Spain and somehow managed to get transportation, I guess a train or something, into Portugal and rejoined the Joint Distribution Committee that had offices in Portugal. And the moment he walked in, you know, as with this walking for hours and hours, they put him to work. And he worked there very hard, and then they gave him the job of being director of the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in the Dominican Republic, and he was sent there.
Why was there even an office in the Dominican Republic?
Because at the Geneva Convention, the Dominican Republic offered room for 2,000 Jews in the Dominican Republic, just to make up the fact that the dictator had killed a whole bunch of Haitians, and the United States was kind of looking at him at the situation, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to be a great benefactor, and I can have 2,000 Jews come and stay with us." And not 2,000 Jews managed to be saved enough to go there, but a lot of them did. And they gave him an area of the Dominican Republic, which used to be owned by a sugar company, for them to resettle in it. And my father's job at the time was, well, first of all, he ran the office of the Joint in the capital, which had quite a few Jewish refugees. And then he was sent to Sosua as well to help establish a community there for the Jewish refugees. The majority of them were young people from Austria. And I used to think that Jews generally have blonde hair and blue eyes because of all those Austrians. I thought that's what they look like. You know? I never had a concept, if you look at my Jewish father, of course.
Now, was your mother in touch with him all this time? Did she hear
No,
from him?
she didn't. Well, he was taken from Paris to the camp, but she didn't know what happened to him for almost 2 years. And finally, that little piece of paper told her where he was.
Wow.
And she had no idea, because there was no communication. We were in the occupied zone of France. He was in Portugal before he was sent to the Dominican Republic.
So what year was this when she finally heard from him?
1940. I was 10 years old then. Anyway, she managed to get together with a Free French and bribe some people. Anyway, she managed to get some documents so we could leave Paris and get to Marseille, try to get into a ship to get to the Dominican Republic. So that night, we packed up our suitcases and went on the train to Marseille because we had those kind of phony little documents. And on the train was my 11th birthday. I was quite upset. No birthday party for me, no cake, no nothing. But anyway, I survived that too. Anyway, the train was an all-night train to Marseille. And I was complaining a little bit, no presents, you know. And my brother ran out and got a little statue from the cathedral in Marseille, a little duplicate. And I thought it was a wonderful gift. It was the only one I had. So anyway, in Marseille, she got in touch with the Joint, and they worked to get us a passage to Martinique, which is closest to the Dominican Republic. However, it took several months before we could get a passage on a ship. We went on the ship, and we were horrified because it was a cargo ship, just a very cheap, ugly little piece of garbage. They had put bunks in the holds, one for the men and one for the women. And it was just like a concentration camp, you know, with layers of bedding. Or anyway, they gave us each a gunny sack, one of those flour sacks or whatever. There was a pile of straw, and they said, you pack that, and that's your mattress, that's your bedding. And then they had a great big kettle, one of those World War I kettles they used to have, and they had living animals on board. And they killed the animals and cut them up and put them in the kettle, and They designated a bowl. They gave everybody a metal bowl. Not everybody. One person out of 10 got the bowl. And that food was dished out from that kettle. And they had to distribute that among 10 people.
Were these all Jewish people on the boat?
The majority, yes, yes. But I know there was this great big bully of a man. If I really think hard, I can think of his name, Rosen something. And he fed his family, and by the time my brother, my mother, and I got our turn, there wasn't much there. But we survived somehow. And it was a horrible, horrible ship. And the kids had to be subject to the fact that they were killing those animals. We kind of made friends with the animals, and out they came and they killed them right in front of us. The cows, the sheep, whatever. Anyway, we got to Africa, and we were all delighted that the ship had finally sailed. But when we got to Casablanca, we went out, we started towards the Canary Islands, and we were blockaded by the British Navy. There were 3 ships with refugees on them. They turned us around, and we had to go back to Casablanca, and they anchored us in the middle of the port. And they were dead bodies in the water. I remember the one was decapitated, so I don't know exactly what happened. I was 11 years old, and I remember being horrified, the fact it was so polluted and so... Anyway, we were anchored there for several, probably months. And...
Were you allowed off the ship?
No. We were prisoners as such. And then we got all typhoid fever. It went right through the ship, typhoid. People started dying. And so the authorities, the French authorities, whoever, decided they're going to take us off the ship and send us to camps. Families with children over 11 years old would go to this one particular camp I have a picture of, and the smaller children would go to a different camp. The smaller children where the rats were biting the children. It was horrible. But the camp we went to was in the middle of the Sahara Desert.
Did it have a name?
I think it was Casbah Tadla. It's on that picture I will give you. Pretty sure it was Casbah Tadla. It used to be a Legionnaire camp, and they decided an abandoned Legionnaire camp. They put us on a train to go there, and then when we got off the train, they had a bus waiting for us. And they said there's not enough room for everybody. This is going to be for just women and children who can go on the bus. And the women started crying, those who had husbands, and my mother, because she had a 14-year-old son. And they said, we don't want to leave our sons or our husbands or whatever. They said, okay, then you all walk. So we had to take our suitcases in hand and walk. And we walked and we walked. I remember I had my mother's portable typewriter. She never went without it. And my doll in the other hand. And we walked for hours and hours and hours. When night came, there was like a grange where they kept food for the camels. And they said we could spend the night in there. The villagers nearby came and brought us some kind of sandwiches, the wraps that they have. But we had no bathrooms. We had to go outside and squat among the camels. And many of us were still having diarrhea from the typhoid fever. But that's all the facilities they had, none whatsoever. And they said we could use the bales of straw to sleep on. And that was it for the night. In the morning, we walked again for hours and hours till we got to the camp. When we got to that camp, they said men on one side where the barbed wire is and the other women on that side. Well,
who was in charge? Who was?
It was the
these...
French, some kind of military. I mean, some of them were legionnaires, and they were horrified. I remember the one guy came up to me and says, "What are children doing here?" And I said, "Oh, we're kids, we're having fun." I remember I found a board in a rock, and I put the board over the rock, and I was seesawing on it, and completely unaware of the fact we were in danger. And we were there for quite a while. They didn't treat us badly. They did the best they could for us, honestly. We all had to work. My brother, 14 years old, had to carry coal from the village. I had to peel potatoes. Olivia, I ate some of the raw potatoes because, kids are hungry. But we were not hurt in any way, except physically the fact that we lived under such conditions. The flies were horrendous. If you ate something, you had to shoo away the flies because they would get all over whatever you were eating. The food was camel, most all camel. It's very chewy. Don't recommend it. Don't order it at the restaurant. It's not worth it. It's very chewy. But the latrines were way out, and there were hyenas all over the place trying to get into us, And the hyenas were howling. And one night I was still feeling very sick, and I had to go way out to the latrine. My mother, of course, went with me, and I was there quite a while. And some of the women we were bunking with went out and got some of the guards and said, "You better go check, maybe the hyenas got them." But they didn't. We were able to get away from that.
Did you have any school or religious services or anything there?
The only religious services was some of the women improvised it, Even on the boat, they put on Sabbath candles, and they were yelled at and said, "We have ammunitions on board, shut us off." And anyway, at the camp, there was no schooling or anything like that, no. And one day the Nazis were there. And we saw them there and said, "Oh my God," And they were talking about shipping us back to Germany. And then one day they called us as an assembling all the prisoners. And there was a big truck there, a pickup truck. And they announced, "If we call your name, get on the back of that truck. You have so much time to get your things together and get on the truck." And we thought, okay, that's it. We're going to being shipped back to Germany. Our name was called, my mother, my brother, and I. We got on the back of the truck.
You knew what was happening in Germany?
Of course, yes. Yeah. They knew it in Paris, too. That's why they were committing suicide, but masses. Anyway, it seemed like that way to me anyway as a kid. We got on the back of the truck, and they drove, and they drove, and they drove, and they drove, all the way back to Casablanca. And then they announced it as, "We have a ship for you." They put us overnight in a school that was closed, and the only places to sleep on were beds with a wire, where you used to have springs, no mattresses. And we spent the night on top of the springs. In the morning, they took us to the harbor to get on the ship, and we looked around, and we said, "Where's the ship?" No, they said, "Down there." It was below the level of the jetty. It was such a little bitty ship. And they put 250 of us aboard that ship to go to New York this time. We were saved. The joint had bought us out practically, and they chartered this little Portuguese boat, the Guinea. I still remember the name. And we were all crammed in there, but it wasn't uncomfortable. My brother, my mother, and I had actually a cabin. And the food was real food. In fact, they had a separate dining room for the kids, and they had hot dogs and something we had never had before practically, not for years. And milk. No, they didn't have milk. Anyway, we sailed, and everything seemed wonderful. We were all very happy, we were saved. And then we had a huge storm, and a waterspout hit the boat, and the boat went sideways. And our cabin was actually underwater because the boat was tilted. And they asked all the men to immediately help pump the bilges because the bilges were filling with water. And this went on for a day or two.
Were you still in the Mediterranean, or were you already
in the Atlantic. We were in the Atlantic. And then the British Navy sent out some ships, one ship anyway, and they towed us into Bermuda. In Bermuda, we had to all get off the ship, and they started checking all the documents and papers. And for one reason or another, they took my father's thesis. My mother had saved that thesis with her life, and they took it away from her. And there's no way you could ever recover that. And the funny thing is, I said we were a group of kids, girls, and by 10, 11, 12-year-olds. We had kind of become a little gang. And we found that the women working on the documents and papers and so on had left one Hershey Kiss on the counter. They were eating them. They didn't share with the kids. We got nothing. But we found that one Hershey Kiss, and there were 4 of us who found it. We split the Hershey Kiss in 4 pieces. Try that again. I don't think it's possible. And we had the first taste of 1 drop of chocolate each after years of not having any. But when we finally arrived in New York. Like I said, there it was, Statue of Liberty. But then the announcement came that those of us who did not have documentation for the States would have to go to Ellis Island. So they put us in taxis and so on and drove us to the jetty, and we went across to Ellis Island. My mother went to pieces when they locked us in a cell, locked up. They only locked us during the night. During the day, we had a hall where we would spend the day, and the kids were sent to a classroom where we did coloring because we couldn't understand a word of English, my brother and I. But they gave us milk. And I thought that was the most delicious thing I ever tasted in my life, a glass of ice-cold milk. To this day, every time I have a glass of milk, I remember that day in Ellis Island when I had a glass of milk. And we were there for a week till we get our documents to go on a cruise ship, actually, to the Dominican Republic. And
was everybody going to the Dominican Republic?
Just us. Just us. Other people were waiting for documentation to stay in the States. We were not going to stay in the States. We were going to go on to join my dad at his job, actually. And so we sailed out, and I remember going to the dining room on the ship, on the cruise ship, and my brother ordering every item on the menu, every one of them, 14 years old and hungry. And after he finished the whole entire menu, the waiter said, "You want to start over?" But I think by then he had enough to eat. Anyway, we arrived to the Dominican Republic after a week of sailing, and there on the jetty was my dad. First time in 2 years that I saw my dad. But there were 2 policemen standing around him, and my mother said, "Oh my God, he's in prison again." But they were just there coincidentally. And my dad took us to a place he had rented temporarily, and there on the table was a great big bowl of fruit, pineapples, mangoes, and a big stalk of bananas. And my brother and I sat down and ate all the bananas on the stalk. I have never liked bananas since. I overate those bananas. And it was just a different life. So my mother and he went out and rented a house, and we moved into a house. And life was really, really different at that point. My dad had a job, and we were sent to school, a little tiny private school in in this beautiful estate where they had a little hutch, and because the owner of that estate wanted to be a teacher, and so she took a few of refugee kids in and Dominicans.
What language did you speak?
Spanish. Well, I spoke French. French was actually my main language then, because we had lived in France since I was 4 years old. And when the Germans came in, we decided not a word of German was going to be exchanged between us anymore. So we spoke French all the time. So French got to be my foremost language, and then I had to learn Spanish. Of course, my parents had spoken German to each other ever since. They were both born and raised in Germany. And my father was working for the Joint. And then he was given the assignment of Sosua. Now, we couldn't reside in Sosua all the time because there were no schools. So we stayed in the capital. But going to Sosua to me was heaven.
Was that the sugar plantation?
No longer.
That was...
It became, well, they wanted basically to have agriculture there. But a lot of the refugees were not agriculturists. So my father established, actually, well, they were living in barracks, in the old sugar barracks. The first thing my father did when he became director of that settlement was to build houses, to have them build houses, tropical houses, so that families could live together, because there were some families that had been saved. And he got them to go into their own way of doing things. They started actually a town. There was one opened up a good store, food and other things, and then you got another man who made mattresses. He opened up. He built a little factory for mattresses, and the other lady was making corsets and bras and so on. So she got established for that, and on and on. It was like a whole town of little businesses and little homes and little gardens.
How many people were there?
There were several hundred, not as many as they hoped for.
But all Jewish?
Yes. And as I said, the majority of them were Austrian, and they were young, and I loved going there. We had so much fun they were all mostly guys.
Ah.
And us girls, a few of us, we just really enjoyed. I mean, we were really in demand. By that time, I was getting to be, 14 or so, and 15, 16. Loved it. And the gorgeous, gorgeous beach there, and the surroundings were absolutely stunning. And the Jews really enjoyed. They actually built a little synagogue and a little school and a little hospital. It was a very thriving little town, like a Western town. No cars. They only had horses. There were no cars available.
So at that point, were you considered Jewish, your family, or?
Well, it never came up.
Mm-hmm.
We were just accepted. My mother was a little feeling outside of things, but she entertained the Jewish ladies, tea parties and so on. She had them come, and because we had a beautiful home, not what I call a beautiful home, a little tropical home, and I have pictures of it, with a gorgeous surrounding gardens, and she would have them over for a little tea party, and this kind of very gracious way of having them over. But we were only there during school vacation time. She spent more time there, but getting into that truck and driving to Sosua to me was heaven. I looked so forward to it because the beach was glorious. And most of the refugees were on the beach on Sundays, and it was a lot of fun. During the week, it was kind of lonely for me, but to go on the beach. And then I had my first boyfriend. He was a cowboy. He was in charge of horses there. His father was a lawyer from Austria, but he was a cowboy. And he was my first romance. I was 15 and he was 19. And it was fun to have a boyfriend, and especially just going to Sosua for that, because he lived in Sosua and I had to live in the capital. But those summers were wonderful. Unfortunately, the mattress factory caught on fire, and before you knew it, the whole town was burned down. And then the war had ended, and people just stood around. The only thing they wanted to do then is to leave for the States. They didn't want to stay anymore.
But not to go back home to Europe.
Oh, no. That was never on their minds. They had a lot of really young people. They called them trainees, that just the kids, teenage boys, had been saved. They had been sent to England, and then from England they were sent to the Dominican Republic. Now, that was another setup. They were sent to the capital. And my father rented a farm, a nice big house with farming. Not big farming, but garden farming. And he put the seniors, the old couples, into the house. And they were outside buildings, which were probably in the past employees of the farm or whatever they call them. And he put the teenage boys in those buildings. And there was a reciprocal situation where the old people cooked for them and parented them, And the young people helped the old people and did the vegetables and all that and brought them in. It was wonderful to go there on the weekend and spend time with them, and we had a little campfire, and they were all boys. And we were all girls at the time, going there on the weekend. And the old people would ask us, what would you like us to cook for you, and so on, and loved it. It was a wonderful, wonderful life at that point.
Were these all your father's ideas, what to do?
Yes. And they came from the States later on to look at the situation and find out that whether there was a good social. My father had a degree by then, a PhD in political science, and that was part of what he did. I mean, he had studied to be forming communities and so on, and putting in social services, and so he was able to use his expertise doing that. Those were all. He had wonderful ideas. But of course, there was politics involved in Sosua, outside with the joint, and anyway, that was another story. But still, it was a wonderful life for a few years. And then the war ended. And some people were able to find some of their relatives in Europe that had survived the camps. And a couple of them came to the Dominican Republic. And you could see what this had done to them. They were emaciated, of course. And they were not functioning mentally anymore. I remember them thinking as being gray. They were pale. One of them, this young woman, they had taken her organs out, her reproductive organs. And she had a fiancé who had escaped and brought her to the Dominican Republic. And he brought her, and I remember how awful she looked. It was just a smell of death on her. And that's the way I felt when I was that young. And then, of course, things started falling apart. So my father was given a job at the university to teach social work. But he noticed that a lot of the students, we were local Dominican students, were missing. And one of the tours he gave as a social work person it was a prison, and he found that they were incarcerated, political prisoners of the dictator. And the government had given him a government car, and the chauffeur, of course, was also supposed to check on him. And he was driven to the airport. Every 6 months or so, he had to go to New York to report to the joint. And he protested. Well, the chief of police actually took him to the airport. And he mentioned, don't talk about it. He said, my father said, of course I will report this. You have my students in prison for political reasons. That's unacceptable. So when he tried to come back, they found I was persona non grata. They would not allow him to return to the Dominican Republic. My brother, in the meantime, had left the Dominican Republic to go to college in Ohio. He went to Kenyon College in Ohio. He had a scholarship for that. And so it was just my mother and I. And the word was sent to us that we would be safe only 5 days. After that, no guarantees about our safety. I was a senior in high school. It was May, and I was graduating in June. And yet we had 5 days to get out. So my my principals immediately printed my diploma, so I would not be without it. And we had to pack up and leave. Well, now, there was a problem with that. My mother was born in France. And the reason she was born in France was because her father was a military the officer in charge of invading the part of France that actually was Lorraine, and he was housed in a castle in Lorraine, and my mother was born there. So she was a German-born national in many ways, but they took away her citizenship anyway. But she was born in France, but she was not a French national. But according to visas, she was French. So the quota for French people was closed. So she could not come to New York. I got a visa immediately. I went to the embassy, and they put a CIA agent into our home to guard us. And we were very, very close to the American embassy because my father worked for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, so we were all part of the embassy scene. So I was put on a ship, the same ship that brought me to the Dominican Republic 7 days earlier. I was put back on.
7 years earlier.
Didn't I say that? I'm sorry, I meant that. By myself. I was 18 by then, a very young 18, a very spoiled 18. But my mother had to fly to Cuba, and my father had to fly from New York to Cuba to be with her to bring her back under his visa, German visa, actually, basically, but under American sponsorship. And so I went by myself to New York, crying every inch, well, part of the way, but then I met a nice little captain on board. But I had to leave one of the boyfriends behind, and the other boyfriend, never mind, I was 18. But from one day being a high school student, I was a grown-up, which I wasn't used to being. And when I arrived in New York, my uncle, who had fled to New York, came to meet me and took me home with him. I had never met him before. I had never met my cousin before. She was also 18, or my aunt by marriage. And they took me in. I stayed with them. And my cousin and I became very close friends forever, since today, up to today. And I stayed with them for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks or so, till my parents finally arrived from Cuba.
What were your aunt and uncles and cousins' names?
My uncle was Eric. I don't know his middle name. I
Baum.
don't think he had one. Eric Baum. His wife, Ilsa? No, my cousin's name is Ilsa. I forgot her name. Isn't that terrible? Lottie, I think it was. I'm not sure. But they were very good to me. But they lived in a tenement in New York. When I mean a tenement, I don't mean one of those rundown places, but, you know, no elevator. They lived on the 5th floor and in a very, to me, dingy street. It was all buildings. I was used to the tropics. Mm-hmm. Palm trees, ocean, gorgeous surroundings, and there it was in New York. And they said, well, probably when your parents arrive, they might get a building, apartment around here. And I burst into tears. I thought that was horrendous to think of being imprisoned in an apartment when my parents finally arrived.
Did you speak English yet?
Yes, I took it. I had English in high school. It was an American high school, and we spoke.
Okay.
Kids pick up languages, you know, very easily. And I don't remember ever not speaking English, or Spanish, or French, or German. It was just automatic. In fact, one of the professors of the university came to the Dominican Republic to look at the Suez settlement. A lot of people did, because they wanted to see how a settlement like this could evolve and saving all these people and then the settlement. But anyway, they asked me, what language do you think in? And I stood there. My father said, well, answer them. I said, I can't. I don't know. I have no idea. It took me years later to figure out that I spoke in the language that was being spoken around me. I mean, I thought in the language that was spoken around me. In other words, if you were speaking English to me, I thought in English, and vice, you know, all the other languages right. Too. It just, I still do it. I switch over, and automatically the brain does it. So anyway, in New York, I was shocked because my mother got off the bus from the airport and she said to me, "Did you get a job yet?" I had visions of college or whatever I was still going to be a kid. But I was no longer a kid then. I had to go out and get a job, which I did, in a law office, which is kind of preposterous considering. But I did very well in the law office. And then I enrolled into Hunter College, evening courses. So I worked all day in the law office and all evening I went to Hunter and studied. And then I met my husband. My husband had a similar history. He was born in Danzig, actually, which is now Gdansk, but he was in a German sect. His father was Jewish, from Berlin. His mother was a Mennonite from the northern part of the Scandinavian countries. You know what Mennonites are? Well, they call them Amish, or more Amish than anything else. And she had fled a very bad situation on the farm and ended up in Berlin, where she met her Jewish husband. They were married because she got pregnant. I only found that out later. It happens. And they had only one child, my husband, Walter. And they also fled. The Jewish father fled into Prague, into the Czech Republic. At the time it was Czechoslovakia. Now his mother and he knew that they were also at the point of being arrested and so on, because that's what they were doing to Mischlings. So the family decided that she was going to get a sled, and they went to the mountains separating the Czech Republic from Germany. And she was typically northern looking. She had blonde hair, and she had those little things, pigtails around her ears, and she looked still very Scandinavian. And my husband was a little blonde boy with blue eyes, looking like her, although his father also had blue eyes, but he looked very German. And they asked permission to go sledding up the mountain, which the permission was granted by the Germans. And when they got to the other side, they slid down the mountain, the Czech guard was there, the border guard, and my mother-in-law asked if he could just stamp the paper to please the little boy to show that he had been there. So he stamped the passport, and they went. They had put their luggage on the train already to Prague, and so they were able to escape that way to Prague. And then later on, they also fled to Paris, and I met my husband there for the first time, but I stuck my tongue out at him. I was 9 years old.
And you remembered?
No, he does.
Oh.
He remembers it. I don't. I remember there was a bunch of boys annoying me, and he was one of them. But I didn't see him again. They lived in the same neighborhood, within a block or so from where we lived, just for 1 year. And then they were able to get documentation to go to the States. So my husband actually grew up in New York. He was just a little boy when they moved there. And I didn't meet them again until we were living in Forest Hills, New York, after my parents arrived from Cuba. And they bumped each other on the street, it's a small town, New York,
Yes.
And he said, "What are you doing here? I thought you were in the Dominican Republic." He said, "No, I'm here now." He worked in the joint office in New York. And I said, "Well, we'll have to get together," So they had met in Paris. And my parents invited them to come over, have coffee and cake in the afternoon. And my father-in-law did not drive, so my husband drove them. Well, I had a little boyfriend visiting me, and we were going to go someplace, and my parents said, "You can't do that. They bring their son. You have to be nice to him." I said, "I don't want to, how kids are. I have plans made, and no, you have to stay here." "Well, my boyfriend can stay too." "Well, okay." Okay, so they stayed. Well, anyway, my mother opened the door when they rang the doorbell, and she said, "Oh my God." My father said, "What?" "She's going to marry this guy." Isn't that funny? And I did.
Wow.
I dumped the other boy. My husband was a student at Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn at the time, engineering student. And we just hit it off. And we were married a year later. And we produced 5 sons. And that's another story of what happens after that, I don't think that's too interesting.
So did you always tell your children about your life growing up?
Yes, yes. Many, many stories I told him, and I had tremendous adventures too when we lived in St. Lucia. And I think a little tired of my stories because they heard them so often, except my youngest son who decided to write a book. But he stopped at Saussure, and I know his fiancée and others said, you need to write a sequel to that because I had so many adventures after that with a husband who was very adventurous because he ended up, we flew all over the United States in our own plane, and we lived on a boat for a year, on a sailboat, and we did all those. My husband, he was a bit of an adventurer, which was a little difficult financially because he dreamed more than he produced. He was a dreamer. And in a way, living where we did here with our kids, but we had a little cottage in St. Lucia. And so when his business here collapsed, he had Saturn Petroleum, we decided to go to the cottage and regroup and rethink what our future was going to be. The kids were grown by then. And I ended up, well, first we sold the cottage and we lived on a sailboat. And interestingly, we met Queen Elizabeth and her husband at a reception at a government house. And we actually were introduced to them personally. And we were introduced as living on a sailboat. And Prince Philip said, I envy you. They were there on the Britannia. But he envied our little sailboat. But after a while, we were in the harbor, and I was asked if I possibly could teach because they were desperate for some teachers. And I thought, okay, I've lived on this boat now for a year. It's time I did something different, and I started teaching. And then the embassy appointed me as consular warden, so I did a lot of the embassy work. And I had a lot of adventures because I became an FBI auxiliary, and I did a lot of investigation for the FBI, which was a lot of fun. Sometimes it was tragic. And I took care a lot of the medevacs of American citizens who got sick or accidents and whatever. And then the company that did the medevacs, Aerojet Ambulance Services, asked me if I would work for them. And I had gotten in the meantime a degree as an EMT, and so I did that for 17 years. I worked for that company.
In St. Lucia?
Yeah, in St. Lucia. And I had a lot of adventures and a lot of different things I did, and it's an entire new book. If somebody wants to write it, I don't, I'm too lazy. But anyway, it was interesting. My husband was quite the guy with many, many ideas and was traveling, and we went around the world in 12 days, not like the other guy, 80 days, but we did it in 12 days on so-called business. So we had a lot of adventures. He was a very interesting guy, a lot of fun to be with, and a very good husband in many ways. Many faults, unless me was faultless, right? And unfortunately, 4 years ago, he passed away. And that was the end of that adventure. Here I am.
So, do you have a message for young people today?
Survive. Just survive. I did. And miraculously. And in fact, there was one incident I'd even come up with. The Germans had invaded, and we were hiding from them, as I had mentioned before. And one day there was a knock at our door in Paris while they were occupied, the Germans were there. And we had a transom on top, the glass transom on top of the door, the way they used to build them. And we could see the top of a German helmet. And my mother hugged us and said, sorry, it's over. No, they got us. They found us. And she said, might as well open the door, otherwise they'll break the door down anyway. So she opened the door, and there was her cousin. And he said, I brought you, I have, the family has sent you money and food. Mm. He was killed soon after. on the front, but he brought us this. He took a chance, but he did it. And the other time we were saved, we were on the train to Marseille, and between occupied France and so-called non-occupied France, there was, of course, a German patrol. And we had our inside of our coats were full of documentation from the Free French, and my mother had sewn them inside her. That was part of the deal of helping us, and then we were going to take all that stuff with us. And anyway, there was a German patrol outside, and we were all ordered off the train. And then they had like a desk there. They were in, and my mother looked and said, "Oh my God!" The man in charge of this patrol was her father's adjutant that had lived for years in their home as the father's adjutant. They had officers had adjutants, and that was a young man who had worked done this. He said, "He's going to know who we are. I think we're done for." The adjutant looked at us. He looked at my mother, looked at the papers, he stamped them, and he said, "God bless you." It makes me cry every time I think about that. So that was another time we were saved. He saved us. And so did the cousin, German. So we had bad people and good people on both sides. All my life I found that out to be the case. So survive. Look at the good side of it. I talked about my past here, and people were saying, how come she had such a difficult past? And those people who have the most difficult past are the most cheerful people. I try to be cheerful around here, and why not? I don't hate anybody, and why not be that way? Why not be positive? And when you only have a short time on this earth, we might as well make the best of it and enjoy what you can. And if you don't like it, just move on. That's my message. Good enough?
Beautiful. Thank you. You mentioned that your mother saved for a long time your father's thesis, and it got taken away. But you also have many pictures.
Yes.
Of everything that was saved. She carried these pictures with her
right
all
through the
these
desert,
years?
and her typewriter, because everything she did on her typewriter. She never wrote by hand. It was always a little typewriter. And then after my father died, she tried to resurrect all his memoirs, and she typed them, and my son has those.
Well, what a gift.
Yes.
And the gift that you give us is telling your story so that others will hear it and understand and know a little bit about you as well.
Well,
So.
I'll tell you one thing. I'm so glad about the Holocaust Museum, as horrifying and awful as it is, to remind people what happened and never let it happen again. Never let it happen again. That's one of the reasons young people in Sosua, for instance, were kind of belligerent too, because they had decided that too. It was never going to happen again. They saw their relatives killed. They were separated from their families. They were all orphans practically. I don't think only 3 of them found any members of their family afterwards. They said, it's never going to happen again. We're not going to let it happen again. Somehow it's going to have to never, ever give in to this evil again. And this is what I'm saying about the Holocaust Museum. Good memories. Many people I know have gone to see it. I can't go. I mean, I went to even when I saw
the interview.
Yeah, even when I saw what I saw, it just made me sick. Was physically ill to think about what happened to all my father's relatives. And strangely enough, all his family pretty much was decimated, killed. There's no relatives left in Germany, except the 2 that escaped, and my father. But my mother's family was also decimated. They were all bombed out. My grandmother on my mother's side was killed by a bomb. So the destruction of this particular war killed my father's Jewish family and my mother's Christian family. I only have a cousin left in the whole entire family of the Klebensteins. It's awful, isn't it? Just think what we've done to each other. Let's hope it never happens again, but I'm afraid it's going to happen again someday.